Good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
In the back? Yeah? Thumbs up back there? All right. Well, my name's Evan Keim. I'm a lawyer and litigator at Jackson Kelly Law Firm here in Charleston. I am formerly, I've got a little bit of background in computers. I was a computer science major in college, and then I was a Unix system administrator for about 3 years before I decided to go to law school. And I enjoyed it. I had a little system that I worked on, a little Unix system, and with an NT front end. And I would come to conferences like these and chat with everybody and find out that a lot of you folks were writing Linux drivers for toasters and whatnot in your spare time. And I quickly realized that I was out of my depth. And so, like so many other folks that ended up in law school, law school is the last bastion for folks that are mediocre at science and math. I'll just say that. So that's where I ended up, but I've enjoyed it. I've got a little bit of a background in computers, as I said, but I'm a lawyer primarily, of course, and I do litigation, and I dabble in data privacy and security laws, and so it's been kind of a nice fit for me having a little bit of a background in the kind of thing that you guys do, because lawyers don't understand this stuff at all, and I really can't underscore to you how different your minds are from the typical lawyer, or at least what lawyers perceive to be different. I don't perceive it that way. I can tell you that, in my few years as a computer science person, I really learned to appreciate good, clean code. And there's just nothing like it in the world, and you can't explain it to a lawyer except that if you learn to write nice, clean code, there are certain things that you can do as a lawyer just beautifully, and then that you understand as far as arguments and process and the way that something goes from being just an idea to an actuality, to a thing that happens. Anyway, so today I want to talk. So I'm the guy that's going to talk a little bit about the law. All right. Now, this presentation was originally written by me to explain things to lawyers that they don't understand, which is technology. So you've got to bear with me when I part of this presentation is about what is the Internet of Things and what is the Internet, right? And I know you guys understand that. So I'll try to focus a little more on the part of this presentation that looks at the law. And what I want to do is give you a sense of how what you guys do challenges the law and how the law reacts to things like technology. And it's sort of if you go to law school, you can take a class called jurisprudence. And it's an elective because it's kind of pie in the sky stuff. But it's the philosophy of law. And I took it. It was an interesting class, and some of what I want to talk about today involves jurisprudence and how philosophers and how legal scholars look at the law and what it's supposed to be doing. That's interesting from the standpoint of technology, because technology moves at a pace that the law simply can't keep up with, never has been able to keep up with. If you think about it, the law's been around for a long time, thousands and thousands of years. Hammurabi, Moses and his scrolls, and for all those years, for all those centuries, the law has been about property rights and criminal law, and that's just about it. And there wasn't the kind of complexity that we started to see when society changed. If you think about the Native Americans' idea of land, they were all hunter-gatherers, and so they thought of land as, well, this is all our land, until it was another tribe's land, and then that wasn't okay. And then farming came along, and we all got this concept that land could be just our land, just an individual person or a family or a clan's land. And that kind of a concept changed the way that the law thinks about property and property rights. And then the Industrial Revolution comes along and technology. So as things become more complicated, the law has trouble, or the law struggles to adapt to complexity. And we'll explore that a little bit, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. But that's the broad context, and the smaller context of our discussion is going to be about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is a great topic for exploring these jurisprudential questions, because it has such potentially problematic issues there. There are a lot of problems that can and do happen because of the speed with which we're just rushing into the Internet of Things and disregarding real risks. So we'll talk about that. So with your indulgence, or change a traffic light, or set in motion some other series of events in the real physical world as a result of what those sensors see and perceive and exchange data among themselves in the virtual world, in the network cloud. So is that a scary thing? Should we be worried about that as a society? Should we be concerned about that? Sure, we really should be concerned about that. And the question is, how's the law reacting to that? And the answer is it's not really doing that. It's not reacting to that. Should the law be reacting to that? Should we be shutting this thing down right now because of the potential risks? Maybe. Those are some of the questions that we'll explore. So from a legal perspective, it's both very exciting and it's also very dangerous. Here's a slide about the Internet of Things. Again, the Internet of Things can be any of these things. Transportation, we've got all of these different fields where the Internet of Things exists, and these things are sensing and flipping switches or doing a certain thing. Thermostats, medical monitoring, baby monitors, refrigerators, televisions, factories, water quality monitors. It goes on. And we're embracing these things at an alarming rate. And they pose risks. So y'all will recall, I'm sure, the Mirai virus. Am I saying that right? The Mirai virus, a denial of, what's the DDoS, a denial of service attack. And that leveraged the Internet of Things to shut down certain aspects of the Internet. There was Reaper. I don't know how you pronounce Okiru. This is a funny slide. The joke here is the broom that says, "Send me $25 or I'll tell everyone on your social network that you were stupid enough to buy an internet-connected broom." This is the Internet of ransomware things. So, how do we deal with the Internet of Things and some of the problems and challenges that it poses? There's product liability law. The Internet of Things would fit into that because the things themselves are products, right? To the extent that they malfunction, maybe product liability law is a good fit for us. There's data security law. That's a developing field that really is sort of in a state of flux right now too. But we'll talk a little bit later about how the FTC is enforcing consumers' data privacy rights, and how across the country there's been an increasing push towards recognizing data security breaches as giving rise to some sort of tort or civil action that the possessors of that information or the owners of that information can bring against somebody that just lets it go or didn't do a good enough job of securing their data. But there is no such thing as IoT law. That's not a thing. Nobody has the law of the Internet of Things yet. There's effort to create something like that, but that's not a phrase that we concatenate, IoT and law. So this presentation will focus on what that law should be, potentially. Put a quote up there. The man there is Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was a justice of the United States Supreme Court from 1902 to 1932, which was a time in which our society was changing very rapidly. We were evolving new technology and new ideas about the government's role and fairness and equality between not just the government and the people, but also corporations and factories and railroads and these drivers of industry that would eventually come to dominate our lifestyle. And so this new society challenged lawmakers, and it challenged Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this quote, "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. The law embodies the story of a nation's development through many centuries, and it cannot be dealt with as if it contained only the axioms and corollaries of a book of mathematics." I really can't underscore to you how important of a guy Oliver Wendell Holmes was in the law. He was a pretty big deal. And he came along to say here, what he's saying here is that the law is adaptive, and that judges make decisions first, and then they come up with reasons to explain them second. That judges are like a sensor that has their finger on what's actually happening in the world and can create or manipulate the law to be what it should be. And this was a radical idea at the time, because from time immemorial, from Hammurabi all the way up until around this time, things hadn't changed enough for there to be this radical change in the way that we think about things and the way that the law thought about what its role was and how the law changed. And so there was a concept in jurisprudence at the time called natural law, and Edward Coke was a philosopher and jurist who said in his famous book that reason is the life of the law. And at the time, these people were very religious, and they had come up in the early and latter part of the 19th century, and they believed that the law was created by God, and that if you looked hard enough, you could find a set of mathematical axioms, reason process, by which you could apply to any problem that you came along in the law, and that through these mathematical workings, you could figure out the answer to any problem. And there was a kind of study that folks were engaged in at that time to try to determine what those mathematical principles were, right? And that way we would have this set of theorems that would allow us to answer all the problems. And so Wendell Holmes rejects that. And his principle is that no jurisprudential principle is immutable. The law changes in response to social change. And that is a natural position for him to take because of where he sat on the Supreme Court between 1902 and 1932. During that time, a lot of different things happened in the law. We invented, for example, the workers' compensation system. The workers' compensation system is a pretty interesting animal in that it is a social contract between industry and the workers and the government. So what happened is we started creating all of these factories, and people started getting injured in the factories. They're getting their toes chopped off, and they're bonked on the head, and the railroads are getting run people over, that are trying to work on the railroads. And all of those people now have a lawsuit. They have a negligence suit against their employer. And so they started bringing these negligence suits against their employer, and that starts to really affect the employer's bottom line. And so the employers and the lawyers for the people went to the government, and the government created this, what's been called the Great Social Contract, where they exchanged, there's a deal was made, and it said if you get hurt at work, you can't sue your boss. You can't sue your company, ever. Not for negligence. You can't sue them. The flip side of that was you can get workers' comp, and every employer has to pay into this new system a bunch of money that will fund taking care of people every time they get hurt at work. And the beauty of that is, if you get hurt at work, you don't have to prove that somebody did it negligently. In other words, you don't have to prove that it was the employer's fault. You can throw a hammer up in the air and stand underneath it and let it bonk you in the head and go ahead and collect your workers' comp. I mean, you really can't do that. It can't be intentional. But you can't prove, you don't have to prove that it was somebody else's fault. It could have been your fault. You could have just accidentally done something stupid. So that's a good example of how the law is adapting and of a place where the law kind of really needed to adapt. So, the Internet of Things is about sensors. I've gone over that. It causes something to happen in the real world. That's sort of what makes the Internet of Things particularly dangerous, right? If I can hack into your ADT system, I can open your door from somewhere else, right? Or I can set off your alarm or start the sprinkler system. So we're definitely diving into this world where the Internet isn't just an internet, it's like a giant robot that can do real stuff to us, right? If we just can get into its mainframe or whatever and actually tinker with, its different functions. So there's very little, like as I said, there's very little law in this right now, but it is, in tech terms, very new, and from a legal standpoint, it's exceptionally new, and we're really trying to figure out how we're going to address it. Kind of went over this a little bit. I mean, there's a couple of different ways we can look at this from a civil liability standpoint. There's the data privacy, like hacking, and then there's product liability, physical defects. If I have some time, we can talk about how the Internet of Things is changing law enforcement. Clearly, having a lot of eyes and sensors out there in the world that can report back to us is something that's pretty awesome from a police officer's point of view. Oh, geez, I just kicked the... All right. Come on, little buddy. Okay. Torts 101. Okay, torts is a fancy word for civil lawsuits, right? So if you go to law school, in the first year of law school, you have to have torts, which is a class about all the different theories of civil liability that can, there's negligence, there's invasion of privacy, there's trespass. These are different ways that you can be affronted and actually get some money from somebody that did it to you. And they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. They're the tort theories, right? There's like 20 of them. And they're a good example of natural law, these ideas that here are the 5 elements of negligence, or here are the 5 elements of trespass. You have to prove these certain things. One of the first things they teach you about in torts, at some point in your torts class, you have to read United States v. Carroll Towing. And this was an opinion written by another very famous judge whose name, ironically, is Learned Hand. This is one of the coolest judge names you'll ever come across. So Learned Hand wrote this opinion, and what had happened was the case was a result of the sinking of a barge called the Anna C. that took place in January of 1944 in New York Harbor. And the Pennsylvania Railroad Company had chartered the Anna C, which was loaded with flour. And right before the accident, the Anna C was moored at a pier on the North River along with several other barges, and they were all moored together in a line to the pier. And a boat, the Carroll Towing, was a tugboat that was sent out to remove a barge from the public pier. And in the process of removing the barge line between one of these two barges, the barges all just floated out. And they eventually encountered the Anna C and sunk her. And what Learned Hand came up with was a formula, right? He was actually what they would call a legal positivist, which is more like what Oliver Wendell Holmes was. But nonetheless, he came up with this formula for negligence. And this is the relativity theory. They've called this the relativity theory of tort economics. And the Hand rule is B, where B is less than P times L, there's a duty. This is how we figure out if you have a negligence duty, or at least one way you can figure out, according to Learned Hand, if there's a negligence duty. And P is the probability that some bad thing is going to happen. And L is how bad is that thing. And if the burden of preventing it from happening is less than the probability times how bad it's going to be, then you have your burden, and you have a duty. It gives rise to a duty. So, if I'm casually eating a banana and I just throw it on the ground right here, what's the probability that somebody's going to slip on it? How bad are they going to hurt themselves? And is the burden of me not just throwing something on the ground, but rather taking it, putting it in the trash, smaller than those two things? If it's yes, then I have that burden. I have the duty. So this is the way that Learned Hand analyzed this problem, the problem of negligence. So for fun, I thought it would be an interesting way of coming at the IoT, the Internet of Things, and looking at the problems with this new technology. I think it might be a neat framework for looking at the Internet of Things. We don't know our burden of precaution yet, okay? Because with respect to the IoT, we don't appreciate the likelihood yet, because we haven't relied on the Internet of Things to the extent that we believe that we are going to, and we haven't been there for a very long amount of time. So let's start with the P of IoT. This was, Hand called this the probability that she will break away. And by the break away, it means break away this line of barges that was going to go out and wreak havoc in the ocean. So the breakaway for the IoT is a security flaw or a physical or software defect or glitch that's going to allow something bad to happen, right? Now, Cisco, a couple of years, estimated that by 2020 there would be 50 billion Internet of Things running our lives. Intel estimated that at being 200 billion things out there connected to each other and our smartphones and everybody else, everything else connected to itself. And this is in an unfettered free market setting. So if we see 50 to 100 to 200 billion connected things in 2020, it will almost certainly mean that the process hasn't been guided by any thoughtful consideration of risk. It's going to be because manufacturers from Thailand and China and every place else just started slapping as many of these things together as they possibly could and got them out into the sales force and got everybody using their products as quickly as possible. So the likelihood that one of these things is going to have some security integrity issue, some design issue, goes up. The more they are and the faster we pump them out, the higher our probability that she's going to break away, the P. In 2015, Hewlett-Packard conducted an Internet of Things State of the Union study. and found that 90% of the devices connected contained at least one piece of personal information. 6 out of 10 provided vulnerable user interfaces, 80% failed to require robust passwords, and 70% used unencrypted network services. Around the same time, in 2015, Dan Kaufman, who was the head of the Information Innovation Office of DARPA, was on 60 Minutes, and he said, "Today, all the devices that are on the Internet of Things, are fundamentally insecure. There is no real security going on." Lack of standards. The lack of standards across this industry is also a concern because in order for everybody to be sort of on the same page about what they're doing and how those things, how the security can be implemented, we need to have these devices running on the same kind of platforms and with the same software concerns and protocols in mind. So there is a sort of self-policing that goes on here I think in part because the law is slow to react. Standard setting organizations that facilitate new tech are working on standards that will help the Internet of Things move to the next level. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is working on a collaborative project to develop a voluntary privacy framework. There's the IEEE standard P2413, which is entitled A Standard for the Architectural Framework of the Internet of Things. There's Thread Group, which is a networking protocol developed in part by Google for use with Nest. Brillo and Weave are a couple of other protocols that are potentially out there. AllJoin is a protocol project between Qualcomm and the Linux Foundation. There's the Open Internet Consortium. Industrial Internet Connection is a consortium of folks, Intel, Cisco, AT&T, GE, and IBM, that have the goal of developing standards specifically for the industrial use of the Internet of Things. There's If This Then That. Raise your hand if you've played with If This Then That. So a few of you. So I've given this talk to the lawyers a couple times. I mean, it's not even close. Nobody's ever heard of it. But it's If This Then That. I mean, I really hadn't played with it until I started looking into this Internet of Things topic, and it's kind of crazy. So If This Then That, you can go to IFTT.com and you can sign up and you can get all of your devices, all of anything you have that's connected to the Internet, just about. You can give the If This Then That website permissions to access all of these things. And then you can create what they call little recipes, whereby if something happens, then do something else. And so let's say for example, if I set my ADT alarm system to away, turn off the crock pot. If I get within 10 miles of my house on my location services on my phone, fire up the Nest from 60 degrees to 70 degrees. I don't know, I think there's probably some fun that you could play with your spouse if you did this too, about you can make Alexa play a song, I mean, when something happens, but they come with prepackaged recipes too that you can just install on your phone, and then it becomes a button. So you can just open up like trigger button to sense this and do that. It's pretty cool stuff. But yeah, it's sort of a second level. If This Then That becomes like a second level of operations on top of all of these Internet of Things that we're doing. Like it's the second stage in building the giant Cyberdyne Skynet robot that's eventually going to become sentient and wipe us all out. Zigbee is another one. 1M2M, ITU-T, Z-Wave. So there's a rush right now of different of these standard-setting organizations and companies to come in and try to create and then protect the tech that they think is going to ultimately win the war of the Internet of Things, to the control and have the power over the Internet of Things. So operability is really important, and it's not quite there right now. The Internet of Things is growing in a way that isn't really being controlled by interoperability concerns. I want to talk a little bit about FRAND. Have anybody ever heard of the concept of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory patents or licensing and royalty? So some of these companies, these standard-setting organizations or companies that create what are called standard essential patents, have a balance that they have to strike between wanting to see themselves rewarded for their contribution for the tech, and also not putting such a restriction in terms of patents and licensing and franchising that they make it impossible for any other players to come into the market. So if you had the tech, say, for 5G, let's say just one company decided they've figured out 5G and that was just going to be theirs, and they were going to make it practically impossible for anybody else to get into the game. What you have is what we've determined is that essentially stifles innovation. And if you don't have other companies coming in contributing, it's like source code stuff. As an aside, I brought this PowerPoint presentation, and I had a thumb drive, but I didn't have my laptop with me because it blew up a week or two ago. So I thought, well, I'd just bring the drive, and that'd be fine because surely there'd be a laptop there, right? It's hackathon. And I came in here and I was like, well, I got this. And no one had a Windows machine, which I think is hilarious. I got there and I'm like, guys, who's got a Windows machine? I don't got a Windows machine. Why would I have a Windows machine? You guys don't think that's funny, but I do. Anyway, the holders of these standard essential patents have got this figured out, and they've developed this concept called FRAND, which is fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory. So a technology, what they'll try to do is, FRAND is a concept that, if patent holders come together and they want to create a new thing in technology, they'll agree to license it and share their information and share their ideas using FRAND. And in other words, it needs to be fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory. And there's no statute or regulation that imposes a FRAND obligation. This is created by the standard-setting organizations and the holders of the standard essential patents in response to members who assert infringement claims against each other. In the 1990s, for example, there's a company called Rambus that famously withdrew from a standard-setting organization for memory chips and began suing all the other members of the organization for infringing its standard essential patent. It creates a lot of waves. It creates a lot of problems, and so before adopting any standard, SSO members are typically required to agree on how they're going to license that, and that they'll agree to do it on FRAND terms. And any SEP, any standard patent that does so that way is said to be FRAND encumbered, which prevents the owner of the standard essential patent from gaining an unfair market advantage. Which I think this is an interesting idea of technology. Remember, part of what I wanted to impress on you is that the more complicated things become, the less quickly the law can adapt to it, and the less the law is able to just jump in and figure out what's really happening. And so this is an example of complexity that has required the people that are affected by it to go along on their own rather than file lawsuits and be difficult with each other. And I think that concept, if you think about that, reflects what's happening in our society in general. I don't know how many people are involved or have been involved in a lawsuit recently, but in the old days, if you filed a lawsuit, you got a trial. Everybody gets a trial. And you would go to trial. Now, lawsuits are generally recognized as so difficult and burdensome and time-consuming and uncertain that none of them go to trial. Almost no lawsuits go to trial. They're all settled, right? And the entire process is now just geared towards settlement. We all know we're going to settle. It's just when are we going to get there and how are we going to get there? It's like the FRAND process, I think. The more complicated things become, the more incentive the players have to play nice with each other, because the more burdensome it's going to be to actually try to work out all the details of this thing and set it before somebody that doesn't understand it or doesn't care and try to get them to resolve it for us. So continuing on with the probability that she will break away. I kind of covered this already, but the more this incredible growth keeps happening, the more manufacturing players get in the game, the more likely it will be that these materials are going to be produced by China and Taiwan, where manufacturing standards are considerably less exacting, and the product is more likely to contain a defect. You will recall that lithium batteries became extremely popular, and then we're putting lithium batteries in everything at a rate that probably should have signaled some kind of caution. And the Galaxy 7s caught on fire, and the hoverboards caught on fire. And Samsung's official statement in response to that a few years back was that it was a manufacturing error that was the result of a sub-optimized assembly process. So uncontrolled growth equals a high likelihood that a sub-optimized assembly process will increase the likelihood that the ANSI will break away. And then lastly, reliance and prevalence. The longer we rely on these things and the more prevalent they become, the more likely that we are going to start to understand what, if anything, these risks really are. And I will point out, of course, the Internet of Things has already been weaponized, right? The Mirai virus has taught us that the Internet of Things does pose a serious risk. And taking down Twitter and CNNBC and CNN is not a huge deal, but it's a pretty big deal when we consider how much we rely on the Internet daily. So we'll move on. So that's me covering the P of the IoT, the probability that she will break away, and the L of the IoT is the gravity of the resulting injury. And to illustrate that, we don't have to do much more than list a few of the things that are happening with these products. So we've got home internet cameras, baby monitors, medical devices and monitors, glucometers, scales, vital sign monitors and ICUs, monitors of the elderly, urine monitors, pacemakers. Pacemakers have been installed in people, surgically implanted in them, and they have wireless connectivity. there was a recall because of this. These pacemakers had been installed with wireless connections that were considered unsafe and could be hacked, right? And so there's a recall of your pacemaker. If there's a recall of your pacemaker, you don't have to have surgery and have your pacemaker come out. But literally, people had to go around and, connect to the pacemaker and open a console and have the firmware upgraded and upgrade the firmware inside the pacemaker, inside your chest and your heart. That's a thing that happened. So that should be scary. Here's an internet-connected device that is a pill dispenser for elderly if they don't remember, or not so elderly if they don't remember whether they've taken their pills today. This thing will just automatically dispense your pills for you. You don't want anybody to hack into that. Here's another terrifying device. This is the OmniNav, which is also an Internet of Things and is connected to Google Maps or something like that. But it steers blind people, and it's also Internet connected. So that would be bad if somebody hacked into that. Traffic regulation has obvious implications. Home security, heating and cooling, self-driving cars. There was a case that went to the Ninth Circuit called K&V Toyota Motor Corps. Toyota and some other manufacturers were using this CAN bus infrastructure, which is a bus mechanism that had some vulnerabilities that allowed hackers to go in and do all kinds of stuff to your car, literally, mess with the brakes and any manner of different, anything you can do with a car, basically. And this lawsuit was brought by a class of plaintiffs that were sort of worried about that. But hadn't had anything bad happen. Nobody hacked them yet. But they sued under a California law that allowed them purportedly to sue for potential violations of their security. And they had these concerns that their cars were going to get hacked and had been hacked. And they won at the district court level, and it went to the Ninth Circuit, which is just before the Supreme Court. In our system, there's district courts, federal courts, there's district courts, and there are trial courts. Then you can appeal to the circuit court. And then if you lose at the circuit court, you can appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this went to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit found that these folks did not have standing. And standing is a concept in the law that basically means you're allowed to be here. You've got a case. And in order to have standing, you have to have an injury in fact. And if you're not injured, then you don't have standing. Because you can't assert someone else's rights. You have to be, you yourself have to be injured. And so the Ninth Circuit found that these folks had had a nice idea, but they didn't have standing because they didn't have injury in fact. However, speaking of black swans, in September of 2015, Wired magazine had this article, which is interesting. Fiat Chrysler had some vulnerabilities in their Jeeps and their cars, and some hackers got into a Jeep, and they were able to control the radio, air conditioning, windshield wipers, the accelerator. They could disable the brakes. They could abruptly kill the engine, and they could control steering, which was a big wake-up call. And as a result of that, there was a recall of 1.4 million Jeeps and Chrysler, Dodge, Ram vehicles, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did an investigation into what caused that and determined that this was a problem that was related only to the Fiat Chryslers, fortunately. But it's a great example of the gravity of the resulting injury. I mean, you guys know better than anybody else. They can fix. I mean, it's all a dance, right, between the people that are trying to establish security and the people that are trying to break the security. So if it can happen once, it can probably happen again. Here's an interesting little hack. Somebody has developed an app that one could surreptitiously put onto your Apple Watch or smartwatch that will track your hand movements, and they've got an algorithm in there that can figure out if when you're typing and what you're typing. Another example, a casino was recently hacked via a thermometer in their aquarium that was, for whatever reason, connected to the internet. And so they went into the thermometer, and then they found their way into the main system, and they downloaded a high roller database and pulled that back out across the network through the thermometer and up into the cloud. So that's the P and the L, and now we have to examine what our burden is, and is it so high that we shouldn't even have these things? So the Internet of Things presents huge risks, high likelihood of harm, and under Hand's formula that translates into significant burdens. So what should we do? Should we outlaw the Internet of Things? I have a theory that if motorcycles were invented in 2000, they would have been outlawed in 2 years. Remember three-wheelers? Anybody ever drive a three-wheeler? Yeah, you can't do that anymore. They've made those illegal. So maybe the burden is too high, but Hand's formula says we can't have the Internet of Things. However, at the turn of the 20th century, we began to have a lot of things, new things. We invented things, and new ways of doing things that didn't just create new risks, they also radically changed our lives. And those things were like cars and trains and new factories that created new things, and refrigeration and all kinds of great inventions that came out. And we put our kids in the factories without gloves and without steel-toed boots, without, we let them run saws without having a protective blade. We let them, grind at the lathe without having glasses on. And we did all of these things in the name of advancement for technology, and let it be free. And gradually, over time, we figured out that it wasn't, number one, maybe we shouldn't have the kids in there, and maybe we shouldn't, maybe everybody's got to wear steel-toed boots, and some gloves would be in order, and there really ought to be some kind of a guard on that saw, and you ought to wear these glasses, et cetera, and a lot of other advancements came out of this technology too in the law, and we gradually figured out how we had to protect people, the way that we should protect people. But it didn't happen overnight, and we didn't have seatbelts in cars until the 60s. So people were dying in cars, people are getting creamed by trains, people are dying in factories. And all of these people sort of were falling on the altar of new technology. So there were risks that we deal with when technology brings us risks. But we've developed a new body of law because the life of the law is experience. And the law adapts, and it slowly adapts. But we ended up having a lot of benefits to the technology that we have. So Learned Hand's formula is a good example of an attempt to impose universal truth or formula on the law, but Holmes would have rejected it. Holmes might say that experience proves that the formula is incomplete, because sometimes the burden of avoidance of a duty might be set so high that it stifles innovation and gets in the way of positive change. and that the benefits of technology can outweigh the simple P and L. And so maybe there's a corollary to Hand's formula that involves another letter, like an I for the importance of innovation, or maybe the law adapts as guided by experience. So we're in the adaptation phase of technology at almost all points in our life. As if it's something that is worthy of being called technology, the law hasn't adapted to it yet, for the most part. I'm just about out of time. I've got more slides. I've got slides about what we're actually doing, the law, what the law is. There's been a lot. There's actually been a lot done in recent years. First of all, the Federal Trade Commission is an interesting body in that they are supposed to regulate trade, and they always, that was what they were created to do. But there's also Congress created this Section 5 of the FTC, the act that creates the FTC, gives them enforcement power to regulate any unfair or deceptive acts and practices. And around about 1988, the FTC sort of decided on their own that any company or organization that promises that takes your data and tells you that they're going to keep it safe, but doesn't keep it safe because they have sort of negligently failed to do certain things to protect security, is engaging in an unfair or deceptive trade practice. And they used that, they bootstrapped that to become the regulators of data security, which is it's kind of one of those interesting phenomena in government and the law. No one ever expected that the FTC was going to somehow become the technology folks that protected everyone's data security. But that's what they did on their own just because of that language in the Section 5 that says that they can enforce unfair or deceptive acts. And they did that for years. And no one ever challenged their authority. No one ever went to the court and said, we challenge your authority, because it was going to be expensive. Everyone just rolled over for years and years and years. And recently, very recently, last year, there was a case called FTC v. Wyndham. This is a landmark case where Wyndham, who had allowed a bunch of hackers to come in and steal data, challenged the FTC's authority, and the court found that the FTC Act expressly contemplates the possibility that conduct can be unfair before actual injury occurs. So that was one of the Wyndham's big arguments, is that these people, that the FTC didn't have the authority to go in and regulate how well you're protecting data before an actual breach occurs. So now the FTC has the ability to regulate anybody, to go in and investigate whether or not they're doing a good job of protecting their clients' or customers' data without there having to be a breach. Which, by the way, I don't know if you guys have been stuck in here all day, but Marriott announced that 500 million of their guests' info has been hacked and stolen today. Just a few hours ago. Real quickly, sorry guys, that was loud. That was the Law and Order sound. Congress passed the Digit Act, which requires a working group to look at the Internet of Things. There's the Cyber Shield Act, which actually Congress, the Digit Act passed Senate. It hasn't been enacted into law yet. There's the Cyber Shield Act, which creates a voluntary labeling system and grading system for any IoT devices that will grade your device with respect to the extent to which it meets industry standards for security. There's the Securing the IoT Act, which provides that the FCC will enact cybersecurity standards for all radio frequency equipment. And there's the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which proposes that there must be minimum standards for connected devices that are purchased by the government. And I'm just about out of time. Anybody have any questions? Nobody? There's one.
Do you think that there's anything that we as citizens can do along with this situation? Not even just as people who are informed with the internet.
Well, I think probably the best thing that could happen as far as what just the folks of the world could do to fix some of these problems is to all sort of be aware of what these security risks are. I mean, most people get a router and plug it in and don't, they never bother to go into that console and look at what any of, I just don't know how many people ever would get a router at all and change the factory settings, or they might do it, and, people now actually probably change their names, but the most important thing, I think, is just awareness. And that probably is just going to take time. I mean, people are going to have to get burned. Right? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you see as legal enforcement in terms of like fines and actual real action taken against people who allow these breaches that happen? So we see it happen more frequently all the time. In terms of fines, etc. Than the American side. Do you really think that there's going to be an evaluation that the U.S. and the TL equation, and if they're found lacking some type of fine assessed?
Yeah. So again, that's the kind of thing that the FTC has taken the lead on, and they have produced some guidelines about. I can just read to you real quick about what the FTC guidelines are, and the reason that the FTC produces these guidelines is because when and if there is an enforcement action that they make, then those guidelines will be the standard, right? So if I'm company A and I've been hacked, okay, and the FTC comes after me and says, "You've been hacked, you big dummy. You must have been negligent." Well, I go back to the 2015 guidelines and say, "Look at me. I've done every one of these things, and this is the head of our technology department. And Bob, or Tammy, get out the book that you wrote that you've been writing down all this entire time. Every time you've been taking any of these steps, you've done it because you wanted to comply with the FTC." So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to establish a standard of what people ought to be doing. So. They put out a detailed report on the Internet of Things saying, here's what you need to do, guys. You need to build security into the devices at the outset rather than as an afterthought in the design process. Train employees about the importance of security and ensure that security is managed at an appropriate level in the organization. Ensure that when outside service providers are hired, that those providers are capable of maintaining reasonable security. When a security risk is identified, consider a defense in-depth strategy, on and on. So that, I think, answers your question. But again, it's kind of odd that it's the FTC that's taking the lead on this. And Congress, of course, is very slow to react. And I'm not sure that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years any kind of real criminal code dealing with that, or any real... a piece of legislation that really says these are the standards and this is how we're going to enforce that.